Hello, welcome to part 4 of the Dune Tank and Brief Sew-Along. Today we're actually going to get to sewing. Yay! Everyone's favorite part. Today we're going to make the entire tank top. That might feel like a lot, but it's really not. A lot of it is repetitive. So once we put the binding on certain spots, then it's the same in other spots. So it's not really very complicated. It doesn't take very long. Doesn't even take that much fabric. It's pretty satisfying quick sew. So that's what we're going to do today. So hopefully you have your pattern ready to go. You've got your fabric cut out and all of that jazz, and you've done your test stitches so you know exactly what you're supposed to do on your machine, and everything's loaded, thread, all that jazz. So if you're ready, we're going to start sewing now. Yippee! So the first step for the tank is to put the front and back pieces right sides together and pin along the side seams. I always like to pin at key anchor points first and then pin in between, so any notches or seams or the beginning and ends of pieces. So I'm going to pin at the hem and at the underarm edge first, and then I'm going to pin the distance in between, lining up those raw edges to make sure that they are lined up from top to bottom. The side seams on the tank are sewn with a 3/8 seam allowance, and I always like to sew towards my hem. That way, should anything get wonky, you could always level your hem off instead of sewing up towards the armhole where things are a little more critical. Now, it's just a knit tank top, but in general, that's the principle that I sew by, is to sew down towards my hem. So we're going to do this at our 3/8 seam allowance. Again, on whatever stretch stitch you tested and feel good about. So once you've sewn your side seams, we want to press that seam allowance towards the back. If you're using a serger, you can just press the entire thing towards the back. If you're using one of the stitches on a conventional machine, you can do what feels best for you. If you have a little extra seam allowance hanging out, you can always trim some of that away. Entirely up to you, based on what you've got there. If you're using like a straight stretch stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch, you might have a little extra than you would like, and you could trim some of that. But regardless, you're going to press all of that towards the back. Now that our side seams are done on the tank, we can attach our arm bindings. So we have our arm binding piece here, piece number 5, and we should have 2. You want to make sure you've cut your notch on here, because that's going to tell you where you are in the center, which is going to line up with our side seams. So we're going to take the pattern piece off, and we'll take one of our arm bindings, and this is actually going to get sewn to the wrong side of the tank. So here we are at a side seam. We're going to find that center notch that we made, which is right here, and that's going to line up with the side seam. So I'm putting the right side of the binding onto the wrong side of the tank. I'm going to pin there first, and I'm going to bring the ends up to pin at the top here where the straps are going to get attached, and I'm going to go all the way up to the top there. Now I'm going to pin this distance in between. So we're going to be sewing this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance like I talked about, and again, if you've never done it on a serger, definitely recommend giving it a practice run first because it can be a small seam allowance to sew with a serger. So we're obviously going to repeat that on the other side. So we have the binding sewn to both of the armhole openings on the tank. We want to now press and top stitch these in place. So we're going to flip the tank so it's right side out, and you should see the stitching on the binding area facing out and a clean side seam. That's how you'll know you're on the right side. First thing we want to do is we want to press the seam allowance away from the tank towards the binding itself, and we're going to do that first. So we're just pushing that seam allowance up into the binding area. Now we want to fold the binding so that the raw edge of the binding almost runs into the seam allowance itself. You want to give yourself just a little bit of room there because we want to turn it again and we don't want it to buckle underneath. If like my knit, it just unfolds itself, it's fine. You have a crease there, and that's what really counts. Some knits just want to curl and undo themselves, and that's fine. We're going to pin it in place when it comes time to sew. All right, so there is our second step. So again, first step, press the seam allowance up. Second step, you're pressing wrong sides together on your binding, the raw edge of the binding just about up into our seam allowance. Now we're going to fold this binding over the seam allowance onto the right side of the tank. So it's going to cover up all of that stitching for a really nice clean finish on both the inside and outside. And we're going to give that a good press all the way across the armhole opening. Just really make sure that you're consistent in your width of your binding and that you're covering up that seam allowance. And now we're going to close that all up and pin it in place. Now at this top corner, the binding is gonna hang off right here a little bit, and that's normal. We're gonna trim that later, so don't worry about that. It should hang over that little bit. Otherwise there would be a gap here. So we want it to meet up with that bit that's under. So that's totally fine. So there's our first side of the armhole. So again, this is our side seam, and we have center front and center back over here. And we've got, this is our right side, so that binding is all rolled to the right side, and the inside's nice and tidy. And we're going to repeat all of that on our other armhole opening, and then we'll take it over to our sewing machine. We're going to top stitch these arm bindings in place with the stretch stitch of your choice. I'm going to use the wide zigzag that's in the pattern. So it's a width of 3 and a length of 2.5. And you just want to sew close to this fold on the right side of the armhole binding area. You don't need to backstitch since this is a continuous front to back, like where there's no, it's not in the round or anything, it's going to be crossed over by another seam. So you don't need to worry about backstitching at the beginning and end. We're going to go ahead and repeat that on our other arm binding. So we're going to take this over to our iron and give it a good press. And then we're going to deal with our front and back bindings and our O-rings. So we have our armholes bound, and now we need to address our front and back necklines. First thing we want to do is trim off that little bit I was talking about earlier. So you're going to have a little bit hanging over the edge right here. And we want to just trim that so it's flush with the front and the back curve. Just that little bit. So again, you can see it there, sort of sticking out, and you're just going to trim it so it's flush. So that that curve is nice and continuous right here on the front and on the back. I'm going to grab the front neck binding piece, and that's going to go on this scoop here in the front. One thing to keep in mind is that the front is higher than the back. The back has a lower scoop, so don't get those mixed up because the binding is actually of different lengths since the scoops are different. So we want to take our front neck binding piece, and the first thing we want to do is we want to mark a 1/2 inch in from each end because we're going to have it hang over by a 1/2 inch on those front corners so that we have something to fold over to put the ring on. So we're going to mark this 1/2 inch in, and knowing that we're going to be putting the right side of the binding onto the wrong side of the neckline, I'm going to mark it on the front side so that I can see it on this side hanging over right here. As opposed to on the back, I can't really see what I'm doing there. So I'm going to mark it on the front, and I'm going to grab my seam gauge here and a water-soluble marking tool. I'm going to use this marker because it will show up really well on this fabric. My knit really wants to curl, so if yours is doing the same curling thing, you're not alone. It can be annoying, but the more you work with knits, the more you get used to that. So there's my 1/2 inch mark from the end. I want to do the same on the other side. And first thing we want to do is find the center. We have a notch at the center on the tank, and there is a notch on the pattern piece for the binding as well. That is lining up with our center point. So we're going to put the front binding right side of the binding onto the wrong side of the tank, and we're going to start at that center, and we're going to pin there first. Okay. Second spot is we're going to bring this end up to this corner, and we're going to let it hang over by that 1/2 inch. So I want to make sure that the raw edges are lined up on the curve of the front neckline, but I want to make sure it's hanging over by that 1/2 inch we just marked. So I'm going to line it up right there and pin that guy in place. So again, there it is on the right side. And then I'm gonna do that same thing on the other side. Again, keeping the raw edges lined up here, but making sure I'm leaving that last 1/2 inch hanging over at the top. Now I can pin this distance in between those 3 anchor points. The binding is going to need to be stretched just a little bit. It's not too extreme. All of the bindings on both the tank and on the briefs are cut to be 90% the length that they're going to be attached to. So they need to be stretched, but it doesn't need to be pulled that hard. So you shouldn't have too much of a struggle to get those to be pinned together. So there's the first half from the end to the center, and I'm going to repeat that on the other half. All right, so there's the front binding pinned. Again, it's hanging over by 1/2 inch right here on each end, and the binding is stretched to fit. And it looks really wavy there, but you can see that even if just the slightest tension, and it lines up just fine. So it's not as extreme as it appears. I'm going to go ahead and pin the back binding while I'm here and sew them at the same time, and the back is going to go on the exact same way. We're going to use our stretch stitch that we've been using all along, and we're going to sew the binding to the front and to the back with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. We've got this overhang here, and we're just going to ignore that. So I mean, it's just going to get included essentially. You're just going to start here and keep going with that hanging over the edge. Want to be careful that this doesn't get pulled down in the process of starting, because you're going to be going down onto it and it might want to get scooched down. And same is true on the other end. You don't want it to get pulled too far forward, or you don't want the underside to get pulled too far forward. You do want to make sure that you're starting and stopping at that 1/2 inch mark. So if you're using a serger like I am, you're just going to be including that first part, and it can be a little bit tricky, I find, with the serger to get started with this. So I'm just moving my pin down so that I can keep it as pinned as close to the end as possible for as long as possible. So I'm going to get that guy in there, and again we're going to just sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you moved ever so slightly, don't worry about it from the ends there, as long as you have give or take a 1/2 inch. And we're going to repeat that on the other scoop. We're going to press the binding on the necklines the exact same way that we did it on the armholes. The only difference is going to be that top area where we had the overhang. So I'm turning the tank right side out so that we can press the binding up towards, we can press the seam allowance up towards the binding. Same as we did before, we are now going to fold the raw edge of the binding so that it meets the edge of the seam allowance. And again, my fabric does not seem to want to hold a press very well, so we're just going to crease it. So again, we're just folding it so that it's just up, almost up against the seam allowance edge there. And we are doing the end where the overhang is as well. That is now just all part of it. We are now going to do a second fold going over the seam allowance, but we want to pay extra attention right here where the arm binding and the neck binding intersect, because you really want to make sure that when this comes over that you are covering up any sort of seam allowance or anything there at the where the arm part is. So you don't want to see anything ugly right there. You want them to just come to this V point. So you want to just really double check that. We're making sure that the upper layer lines up with the under layer so that they're joined and that that binding just continues, and then it's going to cover up any ugliness right here at that point. And then same on this side. You're going to make sure that you're lining up with the bit underneath. So that the binding just continues all the way up. should have something like this, where the arm bindings just go underneath the neck binding, and the neck binding is along the scoop and then a little extra. And we're going to repeat all of that on the back binding. I'm going to use the same zigzag that I've been using, a width of 3 and a length of 2.5 to sew the binding in place. And again, you can use whatever stitch you've been using up to this point. Whatever you used here, presumably you're also going to use here. And we're going to sew from the top of the strap there, so that little extra bit is also going to get sewn. So we've gone all the way up so that anything in that intersection has now been covered by the strap. And we're going to repeat that on the other neckline. We want to attach the O-rings to the end of our front and back binding here. So it doesn't matter which one you start with. You've got this extra bit here, and that is exactly what this is for. You're going to slip the O-ring onto that extra bit, and it's going to get folded over to the wrong side so that you're going to end up with this ring on the right side. So you want to make sure that you're folding the consistent amount so that the ends are the same. You don't want to be lopsided. So I like to make it so that it's tucked right in, essentially right where these two meet, the side and the front. It can be a little bit fussy to do this. I find that there's a lot of thickness here, so you can stick a pin in there to sort of hold things in place. You really, really want to keep this metal piece away from your needle for obvious reasons. We're going to do 2 little straight stitch rows to just hold those guys together. Just doing a back stitch and then going forward and then doing another little back stitch. So I ultimately have just this one little straight stitch right across, and I'm going to do a second row just below that. I'm obviously using contrast stitching so that you can see what I'm doing, but if you're using a matching thread, this will barely even be visible. It'll just get hidden in your fabric. Mine stands out quite a bit, obviously. That's the point, so that you can see what I'm doing. But even still, you just have 2 little rows of stitches there. I'm going to clip all of those threads off, and we're going to repeat that on all 3 of the other strap connections. So this is one front, and then we're going to do the other front, and then we'll do the same thing on the 2 back ends as well. To make our straps, the first thing we want to do is take each of these 2 pieces and fold them right sides together and sew the long ends. So we're going to unpin our pattern piece, and we've got 2 long pieces here. We're going to fold them right sides together, and we're going to pin all along this long edge on both of them. we're going to sew these long ends with our 3/8 seam allowance. You're going to again use whatever stretch stitch you've been using up to this point. I'm going to use my serger, but you are going to continue to use whatever has been working for you. Because these are the straps, we definitely want them to be able to stretch, so be sure to use a stretch stitch for this. So there's our first one, and go ahead and make our second one. Now these are probably longer than you need them to be, because the whole point is that you can make them as long as you want. So once you've made one tank and you know how long you want your straps to be, you could always reduce the length of these so that you're not making them longer than need be and wasting time and fabric. All right, so we need to turn these straps right side out. What I use is a little bodkin. If you've never seen one of these before, it's basically a pair of tweezers with a little stopper on it. You can also use a safety pin. So what I like to do is put it in on one end with the point, the connection area facing up. So if you're using a safety pin, the open section would be where this open section is. And then I'm just gonna grab the end of the strap, and for the bodkin I'm locking it in place. For a safety pin you would be closing it. You'd be sticking it through here and closing it. So it's attached at the end there. And I'm gonna just scoot this down, and the beginning is always the hardest. You're sort of folding it up on itself. So you gotta get it started. And then it becomes a lot easier. So I'm just gonna scoot down my bodkin, or you would be scooting down your safety pin if that's what you're using. And then you're just slowly pulling the other end of it over itself. I usually move, you know, not too aggressively because I don't want it to come undone from the bodkin. So I'm sort of gentle with it. There's also those tube turners that you can buy at stores like Joann's and stuff that turn the tubes. Here comes my bodkin out of the other end. It always feels good when you can hold the strap, and then I can be a little more aggressive in the turning process. And I can just take the bodkin off, or again, if you're using a safety pin, you can just take that part off. So now we have our strap here. It's obviously like a soft tube. Also, I should note, I'm using a serger obviously, so I don't have any extra seam allowance, but if you're using a conventional machine, you can benefit from trimming away any extra here to just remove any of that bulk. So we're going to now press this flat, and you're going to want to push that seam to one side. So I'm going to lay this down and just sort of, I like to sort of squish it with my fingers to just make sure that that seam is off to one side, so that I'm flattening it consistently. If my seam is sort of bringing a bunch of fabric with it, then the strap is not going to be the right width because it's going to vary a lot, because some of it will be sucked into that seam. So I'm just bringing the seam out to the edge essentially, so that this thickness is the same width. And it can be a little fussy, and again, this is why once you know how long you want your straps to be, it's the less you do of this, the better, really. So no need to do like, you know, a foot more than you need. Okay, so there's my first strap. It's a nice consistent thickness. And I'm going to repeat both of those steps on my other strap. So we've made 2 straps. Here's both of our straps ready to go. And we're going to now put 1/4 inch elastic inside the straps. Technically, this step is optional. If you really don't want to put elastic in there, you don't have to. I do find that when you top stitch through the strap, it tends to stretch the fabric out. So if you measure this strap right now, and then top stitch through it and then measure it again, it's going to be longer. So I didn't want that to happen, and I also didn't want the strap when it's on your body to get stretched out in wear, which is why I'm putting elastic in the center of it. But again, technically that part is optional. If you just want the straps as is and you don't want to put elastic in there, you don't really have to do this part, but I much prefer it. So 1/4 inch elastic. Again, you're going to use a bodkin or a safety pin. You're going to clip it to the end, and you want to try to make sure that you don't twist this in the process. The good news is that the strap is not very wide, so it's pretty easy to keep it right down the center. So I'm going to just scoot that along, and again, I'm going to be really deliberate with it and make sure I'm not twisting it in the process. So I'm going to just be gentle as I'm moving it through. So there's the elastic coming out one end and coming out the other end. Now I'm using a scrap, so you obviously don't need to leave this much extra. But I do find if you leave a little extra, it's a little bit easier to get it started into the machine. But ultimately your strap is probably longer right now than you want it to be anyway. So it's fine if if the ends aren't like perfect when you go to sew it. We're going to stick elastic through the other one. Same exact process, of course. So we have a pair, and then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch through the elastic and the strap. I'm going to use the same zigzag stitch that I've been using on the other steps, a width of 3 and a length of 2.5. And I'm just going to go straight down the middle of my strap. And it can be a little bit precarious to try to stay right in the middle, so you want to just take your time. And again, it's okay if this stretches a little bit, because with the elastic it's going to bounce right back. So there's the zigzag right down the middle of the strap. I always like to give this a bit of a press afterwards. And again, ultimately this is longer than you're going to need it to be, so you don't really want to worry about the ends too much. You can just trim that extra bit off. And we're going to do this on our second strap. It's time to attach the straps to the O-rings. So we're going to attach to either the front or the back. In the instructions I say to attach to the 2 fronts and then adjust it in the back, but honestly you could also attach it in the back and adjust it in the front, whichever is easier for you. We're going to attach these in the exact same way that we just attached the O-ring. So you're going to slide one end on, and we're going to do those 2 rows of stitches, and we're going to do the same thing on that same side, whether you're on the front or on the back. And then we're going to test the fit and adjust the strap, and then attach it to the back or the front, whichever, the opposite of whichever one you just did. So we're going to do that, attach them to the one side first. So there's our first side. And again, we'll clip all these rogue threads off, but it's exactly like we did before with the 2 stitches. And we'll keep going on the opposite side right here with the other strap. I should clarify. This strap staying over on that side. This strap comes over here to this side. So, straps on each side of this scoop. This is my back, and I'm gonna now pin these straps to the front and try it on, and then clip off whatever strap is excess. All right, it's time to hem our tank, and for the bottom, it's just a very simple 1/2-inch fold that is then top stitched. I like to start at a side seam so that I can do my back stitching near a side seam instead of in the front or in the back. So we're going to start with our zigzag just right here next to this side seam. And again, you can use whatever stretch stitch you like for the hemming. When you reach where you started, you can, of course, just do a little back stitch there. And then always you're going to want to give a hem, but especially a knit hem, a really fresh press at the end, because it's going to always look kind of soft and wavy. So you want to give it a really good press. Use the steam in your iron. You don't want to stretch it out, but you do want to just squish it with your iron. So we'll give that a really good press. And our tank is finished. Hooray! So we're all done. We've got our straps on. We've got our little rings here. And again, I used a contrast stitching so you can really clearly see what was happening on this fabric. So everything stands out, but if you were to use a matching thread, all of this would be much more invisible. But that is all finished now, and now we go on and make our matching briefs. Or not, maybe you just want to have a bunch of tanks. That's cool too. It's a really good wardrobe staple layering piece. And now also you're ready to move on to some very exciting hacks as well. All right, we're done with the tank. There's still the briefs to make. But that's really exciting. The top half of our project is finished. If you're just making the tank, you're finished. Hooray! Although why aren't you making the briefs, man? They're super cute. If you're only making the briefs, again, why aren't you making the top? I don't know. But if you are making the tank, we are finished with that part. I hope you learned something. I hope it was easy to follow along. If you have any questions, of course, do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email is down below. All of my contact info is down below, my website, all that jazz. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, or you can put them in the comments. I don't know, I'm new to this YouTube thing. I don't know how it works really, but I'm sure I'll find it if you put something down below, or if you just write to me, my info's there. So in the next episode, part 5, we are going to make the briefs, which are an even faster sew because there's none of that strap business. And again, it's repetitive in that the 3 openings are all bound exactly the same. So if you've made the tank, make the briefs. You will love them. I love them. And they're really, really simple. So I will see you in part 5, which is the last part of this main sew along. And then we're going to get into our hacks, which are really exciting. I hope you are excited about that part too. I will see you there. Okay?